This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Hey Holly, how's it going?
It's going.
Today we're going to talk about the Death Star. How do you feel about that?
Scared and intrigued.
So, I think those are both very appropriate ways to feel about something that's called the Death Star. The very name, the Death Star, evokes dread and despair across the galaxy. During the Galactic Civil War, the Death Star played a pivotal role in the first major engagement in the escalating conflict. A second Death Star hovering over the forest moon of Endor played an equally pivotal role in the next major turning point in the war that would eventually restore freedom to the galaxy.
But of course, the question comes up of exactly where the Death Star came from. And the answer to that question is a very long and complicated one. And it reaches all the way back into the Clone Wars and even to the time before that conflict started.
So the Death Star itself began as a design by Archduke Poggle the Lesser of Geonosis. The Geonosian had worked his way up from drone to Archduke and designed the droid foundries on his home planet and designed the systems that offered battle droids autonomous control rather than the centralized systems that cost the Trade Federation the Battle of Naboo. Poggle claimed, and we did an episode about that, two-parter on the Battle of Naboo. You should check it out. Poggle claimed for a long time that Count Dooku had provided him with the initial plans for the Death Star, and he merely refined them. But it seems more likely, as time has gone on, that they were his idea from the beginning.
Sometime before the first Battle of Geonosis, the Separatist Alliance, led by Jedi-turned-Sith Count Dooku of Sereno, requested that Poggle begin work designing a massive space station, larger than any ship that had been built in the fleet. Based on the central control orbs in Lucrehulk-class droid control ships, this station would be of a scale that no one had ever seen before in the galaxy, and it would be the size of a small moon and contain a powerful weapon that would strike fear in the hearts of enemies.
Though Poggle designed the structure itself, the super laser proved to be an entirely more complicated matter and would be the single element that would delay the Death Star's deployment until more than 20 years after its initial design.
Unfortunately for the Separatists, the plans for the superstation fell into the hands of the Republic, and both factions would compete over that technology. Over the course of the Clone Wars, the Republic and the Separatists would work to develop a Death Star with a superweapon powerful enough to end the war.
Now, after the Second Battle of Geonosis, Poggle the Lesser found himself captured by the Republic, and the Republic found the plans to the space station in his possession. Poggle refused to acknowledge any information about the Death Star project in repeated interrogations with Jedi and military officials. Assuming that the Separatists were also hard at work on their own battle station, the Republic secretly began work on theirs.
A Parwin scientist by the name of Gubacher oversaw the cannibalization of the droid foundries of Geonosis for use in the construction of the battle station. He saw to the construction of the prime meridian of the station's skeleton and began on the equator, but had issues finding workers capable of proceeding.
And this is where Lieutenant Commander Orson Krennic comes into the story. He was an engineer with the Republic's Special Weapons Group. He saw two things no one else seemed able to. First, the key to building the superweapon, and second, the key to convincing Poggle the Lesser to defect and use his Geonosian workers to build the next phase of the project. But that was met with mixed results. Poggle would end up redefecting to the Separatists and die at the hands of the Sith Lord Darth Vader on Mustafar.
And though the war ended with the Emperor's purge of the Jedi and the subsequent shutting down of the droid armies, development of the moon-sized space fortress continued under the watchful eye of the main Imperial power triumvirate of Emperor Palpatine, his Sith enforcer Darth Vader, and the military might of Wilhuff Tarkin. Krennic, though, would play a vital part, ambitiously clinging to what power he could, power that really could even rival Tarkin himself.
Construction of the Death Star proceeded in the orbit over Geonosis at a drastic pace for some time. Though by the time a survey was made of the planet just a few years before the destruction of Alderaan, the only trace of the construction in the Geonosian orbit was the remnants of the abandoned orbital construction platforms that were there. When the surface of the planet was scanned for life, it was found that the Geonosians had been wiped out completely, leading some to assume that a genocide had occurred to maintain the secrecy of the project.
And these suspicions would be confirmed when a rebel cell, led by rebel extremist Saw Gerrera, went to investigate the claims. Saw's entire cadre was killed, but Saw himself was rescued by Phoenix Squadron. And together, they found evidence that the Empire had indeed used a biological agent to cleanse the planet of life. Phoenix Squadron and Saw Gerrera found one surviving Geonosian who was safeguarding what they believed could be the last queen egg. But this mission didn't bring the rebellion any closer to the truth of the Empire's secret weapon.
Yeah, it was, it's one of those things where they just got closer and closer, and they were almost there to learning what it was that they were going to be up against, and it just didn't happen. They either came to the wrong conclusions in some cases, or the evidence just wasn't there. The Empire had covered their tracks too well.
Yeah, it seemed like along the way they learned a lot of stuff, but it wasn't always the stuff they were hoping to learn.
Yeah, or the stuff that they needed to prevent something like Alderaan.
Yeah.
So the construction of the weapon as part of the superstructure had its share of many other setbacks as well. In one instance, one setback involved Grand Moff Tarkin's ship being stolen. In a bid to jockey for power and the rank of Moff, Vice Admiral Dodd Rancid orchestrated a plot to delay the construction and steal Tarkin's ship, the Carrion Spike. The biggest setback wasn't a construction delay, though, but the lack of that functioning superweapon.
Like most superweapons, the technology that powered the Death Star's laser was based on misappropriated energy research. And the key was Galen Erso, the galaxy's leading expert in kyber crystals and a conscientious objector who wanted to make the galaxy a better place by working to create clean, sustainable energy available for everyone. In his mind, the key was going to be found in the living kyber crystals that the Jedi had held in secret for generations.
Realizing that Urso's research was the key to cracking the superweapon problem, Orson Krennic did everything he could to keep Urso working on the science behind energy transference using the crystals as a conduit. With the Jedi dead in the wake of the Emperor's Purge with Order 66, there were no shortage of crystals, kyber crystals, lying around the galaxy to provide for Urso's research. Under the supervision of Grand Vizier Mas Amedda, Krennic provided Urso with every resource possible.
And these kyber crystals became hot commodities for the Empire. The Empire wasted absolutely no time in stripping planets like Jedha, the site of a kyber temple, and Ilum, where the Jedi went to seek kyber crystals for their own lightsabers. But these weren't the only places in the galaxy to find kyber crystals either. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker recovered one during the Clone Wars that pirates had been trying to sell to the Separatists.
And that was a kyber crystal the size of a small repulsor freighter, or a small repulsor ship.
So, significant.
Yeah. So, though Galen Erso tried disappearing once he realized what his research was really being used for, that didn't last long. After an absence of a few years, Krennic was able to track Galen Erso down on the remote planet of Lamu. There, Imperial forces murdered Erso's wife and orphaned Erso's young daughter, Jyn. And Jyn will play a prominent part later in the story, though. Know that her parents had a contingency plan that allowed her to hide from the Imperial forces and escape until later, although Krennic did take Galen into his custody.
So years passed, and the development of the super laser continued apace, this time with the forced help of Galen Erso. And Erso, stationed on the Imperial refinery planet of Edu, realized that the Empire had the technology they needed to make the weapon without him. So even though he helped stall the work, he was complicit in creating the superweapon. To mitigate the effects that this had on his conscience, he worked to create a flaw in the Death Star that someone would eventually be able to exploit, so the station could be destroyed before it was turned against civilian populations.
But that leads us to the holy city of Jedha. Jedha City was a magnet for worshippers of the Force of all stripes from across the galaxy. And pilgrims gathered around the Kyber Temple, which was protected by the Guardians of the Wills. But as we mentioned earlier, the temple had been stripped of all its kyber crystals, and the Imperial occupation continued, rooting out every last bit of the needed mineral. But a number of factors came together to cause this to be the first site the Empire destroyed with their first test fire of the Death Star's super laser.
Perhaps the biggest reason was the knowledge that an Imperial defector named Bodhi Rook had arrived in the Holy City, trying to peddle information to Saw Gerrera, and in turn, the entire Rebel Alliance, and that was to inform them of the existence of this superweapon. There was obviously a desire on the part of the Imperials to fill that breach of information. The second reason was that Grand Moff Tarkin was unconvinced that the weapon was even going to work, and he thought a test was in order to prove whether the weapon was truly worth what they were hoping it was. And if the test failed, he would be able to remove Krennic and use the Death Star as his flagship. But of course, if the test succeeded, his plot was to take control of the station regardless and have that might under his control.
So over Jedha, Krennic ordered a single-fire ignition of the super laser to destroy Jedha City, and this had two chilling side effects. First, it eliminated almost completely Saw Gerrera's band of rebels, a thorn in the side of the Empire for almost 2 decades. And second, it destroyed the Holy City itself, which was the last visible reminder of the Jedi in the galaxy. And there was every chance it would have been destroyed prior to this moment, but the Empire was still mining those kyber crystals before that point.
The second firing of the weapon was a direct result of the Imperial defector on Jedha. So Bodhi Rook, along with a rebel intelligence officer named Cassian Andor, Jyn Erso, who had at that point joined up with the rebellion, and a pair of former Guardians of the Whills, managed to escape the destruction of Jedha City by mere moments. With the help of Bodhi's information, they were led straight to Galen Erso on Edu. And in his dying breaths, he helped Jyn and the rest of the rebel team realize that they needed to head to the Imperial citadel of Scarif to recover the plans to the Death Star if they were ever going to have a chance to stand against the might of this incredible superweapon.
Scarif was where the Empire kept their archives. Because this included military secrets of all types and all military communications, it was protected by a planet-wide shield accessible only in one spot, protected by what was known as the Shield Gate. In short, the planet was seen as impregnable.
And this rebel team, Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso, tried to rally the entire alliance around a mission to steal the plans. But Rebel High Command thought this entire thing was way too risky, so this team decided to go on their own against the wishes of the Rebel Alliance. So using a stolen Imperial cargo freighter and dubbing themselves with the call sign Rogue One, this band of rogues managed to use a small, tiny force to penetrate Scarif and break into the Citadel archive.
When Rebel High Command heard that the mission was on with or without them, because they'd intercepted Imperial transmissions talking about Rebel fighting on the surface of Scarif, the rebels scrambled their forces to join the fight, led by Admiral Raddus, a Mon Calamari in command of the Mon Calamari cruiser, the Profundity. The Empire was not expecting this attack in any way, and so the rebels were able to overpower them quickly while the ground forces went to work trying to recover the plans to the battle station.
It was at this point that Grand Moff Tarkin aboard the Death Star arrived in orbit over Scarif. And knowing that Krennic was at the Citadel, presumably to fill the breach that he had ordered him to handle, and that the plans there were likely to be stolen, Tarkin ruthlessly ordered the firing of the superweapon on the Imperial installation. He killed everyone below, including all of the rogue team.
But during this battle, which would go down as the first major victory for the rebellion in the entire war, that rogue team, those spies on the surface, they managed to beam the plans to the Death Star to Admiral Raddus on the Profundity. And since Darth Vader, the Emperor's enforcer, boarded the Profundity, copies of the plans were made and passed along to the crew of the Tantive 4, who were docked inside the Mon Calamari cruiser for repairs.
The Tantive 4 escaped, but only momentarily. Darth Vader quickly caught up to the blockade runner and boarded it above the desert planet of Tatooine. Princess Leia Organa, the senator from Alderaan, was aboard, and she jettisoned the plans in an escape pod with 2 droids that landed on the surface. Vader took Leia prisoner, sent a team down to retrieve the plans, and then took the princess to the Death Star for questioning.
Princess Leia was, to put it mildly, not cooperative. She resisted a mind probe from Darth Vader and would still not reveal the location of the plans or the hidden rebel base. And that's when Governor Tarkin got an idea. He ordered the Death Star into the orbit of the princess's home planet and brought her to the bridge.
At that point, Tarkin threatened her with the destruction of her home planet of Alderaan if she did not give up the location of the rebel base. Sensing that Tarkin wasn't bluffing, Leia offered him the information that the rebel base was on Dantooine. But having gotten what he wanted, Tarkin was unrelenting. He ordered the crews of the Death Star to fire on Alderaan, completely obliterating the planet in one blow.
The destruction of Alderaan was a flashpoint in the Galactic Civil War. The Rebel Alliance had, to that point, been a loose confederation of cells and disparate groups, and Alderaan was a wake-up call to those in the galaxy who opposed the might of a government that would turn a weapon like the Death Star on its own people.
Tarkin thought the Empire would rule the galaxy by fear, but the hope of the rebellion had other plans for them. Princess Leia knew the plans that she had jettisoned off of her ship were basically the only chance that the rebellion had to survive. You can imagine her surprise when a Jedi Knight, a pair of smugglers, and a farm boy suddenly arrived on the Death Star with her droids and the stolen plans, ready to rescue her from the battle station.
It's like that moment where it's like, hey, I got rid of these, right? Because you need to get them to the rebels. Why did you bring them back to me in the heart of Imperial territory on the Death Star? Like that seems silly and risky.
Right? It's like that well-meaning passerby that's like, you dropped this.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So in a both daring and foolish escape attempt, the rebels whisked Princess Leia and the stolen plans from the Death Star and headed straight for the rebel base, which was really located on Yavin 4. Princess Leia, confident that the Imperials only let them escape because they were tracking them to their base, knew that time was not on their side if they were going to do something about the Death Star.
From their secret base, the rebels analyzed the plans, and they found the weakness in Poggle the Lesser's design that had been altered and inserted by Galen Erso. And using this information, they launched a desperate strike against the Death Star that was nearing their base at the time. So using single-pilot snub fighters against a space station the size of a moon, they managed this attack. But if they lost, that meant that the Death Star would undoubtedly destroy Yavin 4 and the entire rebellion along with it.
In the end, the rebellion prevailed. Galen Erso's trap worked, and a proton torpedo blasted into a thermal exhaust port caused a chain reaction that destroyed the station, brought the whole thing down. And they saved their base and lived to fight another day, hoping the terror of the Death Star would forever remain a memory.
But of course, Emperor Palpatine had entirely other plans.
Yeah, working in secret, the Empire applied the lessons they learned from the first Death Star's construction and hurriedly began work on a second dreaded Death Star over the forest moon of Endor.
Using cutting-edge shield technology, in fact, that may well have been discovered through Orson Krennic's Celestial Power Project, the Empire sought to protect the new superstructure from an attack like the one that had destroyed the first Death Star. And all of this was part of a plan by Palpatine to lure the Alliance to restore the Republic into their final doom. But, of course, that could be an entire episode on its own.
As for the legacy of the first dreaded Death Star, the specter of death around it will never disappear, and the ghosts of Alderaan's absence will forever haunt the galaxy. After Endor and the second Death Star, there was some hope that planet-killing weapons would be forgotten.
But of course, the First Order, the remnants of Palpatine's scattered empire, had plans of their own. Some 30 years after the Battle of Endor, the First Order would double down on the idea of a Death Star and unleash the wrath of Starkiller Base on the good people of the New Republic. But again, that is an entire other episode.
And that's it for this episode about the Death Star, which, there's a lot of... What's really interesting about the story, I think, is the idea that, the Separatists came up with the plan for the Death Star, then the Republic are the ones who decided, hey, they're working on one of these, we need to work on one of these too. But there was only ever one, and it was all Palpatine behind the scenes, pulling the strings of both sides to make them feel like there was this urgency in the war for them to develop something this bad.
Right. Yeah, it's it's one of those things that when we look at it with the historical lens, it's so terrible that I can only imagine what it was actually like for the people that lived through this ominous thing appearing in the skies above their worlds that they had never even heard of. And then, of course, being, completely terrified and eventually destroyed by it. It's a really sobering thought.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, there's little bits of nuance to the story too, like all of the people who sacrificed themselves along the way to make sure that the rebellion could destroy it, like Bodhi Rook, the defected pilot, who actually told the story that the planet killer existed. He was from Jedha City, and he had to escape the destruction of his home planet, which was sort of that first small scale taste of destruction that members of the rebellion would have to witness firsthand, just like Leia did with Alderaan.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to note that the fact that people didn't know the Death Star was happening. Like I kind of mentioned it just a moment ago, that this was a thing that appeared and people didn't know what it was because they had managed to keep it secret for so long. And even after Jedha City, they put out like basically a press release saying, "Oh no, there had been an explosion at Jedha City that caused all that destruction." So it's really terrifying in that regard that a project that large could go on completely under cloak of darkness, basically, for so long.
Well, it actually, I think it says a lot about the Imperial security apparatus, right? Like you look at the daring bits of happenstance that actually allowed the Empire to lose the plans was ridiculous, right? Like it's the Rebel strike happened exactly the only way it could, and perpetrated by the only people that would have the information and the knowledge and the know-how to take care of it and take those plans out of there. And then, they got away, but only just a little bit, and Leia got them to the people that could get them to the rebellion, but they ended up taking them back to the Death Star, and it was like they had to steal the plans all over again just to escape. I don't know, like the whole thing is just skin of your teeth, and it shows you how well constructed the Imperial secrecy machine was.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't have any mail this week.
You don't?
No, I don't.
I'll once again offer what I always offer, which is that I'll make some up.
No, you don't need to make any up, but if people would like to send us email, they can go to fauthentichistory.com and send us an email in the contact form. There's just a button for contact, and you can get a hold of us that way. And I would recommend after this episode, if you go back and listen to our episode on Grand Moff Tarkin, it sort of adds some nuance to this, and our episode on the lost culture of Alderaan sort of helps accentuate the fact of the things that we lost because of the Death Star.
Yeah, it gives it a wider scope, and you really get a sense of how this impacted the galaxy.
So where can people find you, Holly?
I am on Twitter as @SurliestGirl, and they can find us as Fauthentic History as @Fauthentics.
And you can find me at Swankmatron. You can find us both on the Full of Sith podcast as well. And until next time.
Au revoir.